We really like working with clients who want to meet their purpose, grow their purpose in anything where marketing can add to people's quality of life, or as we say, marketing for good.
Welcome to the Marketing for Good podcast. Before we begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands in which we are recording this podcast today. Nicole Meacock is on Gadigal land. We acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And Georgine, please help me if I get the pronunciation wrong. We'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal people and the Ugra people in Brisbane. I'm on Darkajong land here on the central coast of New South Wales, and we'll pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So I'm delighted today to be joined by two leaders from Rennie Advisory. We have Nicole Meacock and Georgine Duncan, who sit at the intersection of sustainability-related strategy, risk, investment, economics and policy reform. Welcome, guys.
Very much, Leah. Thank you. Nice to see you, Leah.
Oh, lovely to see you. So just to give our listeners a bit of background and context, Nicole is the Director of Economics Reform and Sustainability at Rennie Advisory. She's worked across Australia, the US, Europe, Asia, Pacific over the past 20 years, helping organisations embed sustainability principles and ESG resilience into their strategy, their governance, risk management, reporting and investment decisions. And Georgine Duncan is a distinguished leader in sustainability and climate action and the Executive Director at Rennie Advisory. With over 20 years' experience spanning public and private sectors, she's driven initiatives in renewable energy, circular economy, natural capital and climate policy aimed at aligning human development with planetary boundaries. So today we're exploring the idea that good external governance and stakeholder engagement is critical to the success of achieving sustainability outcomes and Australia's energy transition objectives. I'd love to have just to sort of touch on the broader context. We know that there's, never been more strategic focus, data, tech development and more investment flowing into sustainability outcomes, including the next tranche of the energy transition. Yet many sustainability-related initiatives and projects do continue to face opposition as well as uncertainty, delays, budget backlash, and in some cases, they do fail. Georgine, I wonder if you can tell us a bit about Rennie, your recent work, and talking to this state of affairs for sustainability initiatives and projects.
Thanks, Leah, and really happy to kick us off. If I could also just add my acknowledgement of traditional owners. Certainly very privileged to be sitting here in Meanjin and thinking long and hard, I guess, about the things we're trying to do, particularly in Queensland, and how we might take on First Nations knowledge. So happy to make that acknowledgement. But in terms of Rennie Advisory, look, we're probably one of Australia's largest advisory firms focused exclusively on the energy transition and net zero. We've been going for 5 years and growing very, very rapidly. Just this week, we've sort of hit another major milestone. I don't know if it was this week or last week, Nick, but we certainly opened our office in Malaysia. And we've had a recent acquisition. So we've now got people in India, Malaysia, and Australia, so growing very rapidly, and we sort of cover, got offices in WA, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, headquartered in Queensland. But we've got everything from sort of everything that you need in that energy transition in terms of whether it's capital advisory, business strategy and operations, regulatory advisory, and most recently this full energy market modelling and connections capability. So real sort of end-to-end advisory. So a sort of deep advisory in this space. But Nick and I sit in a group called Economics Reform and Sustainability, ERS. We love a good acronym. We're a multidisciplinary team that sort of looks at the intersection of a lot of these issues. So we're economists, policy and regulation specialists, and sustainability practitioners, and we advise both government and private sector. We tend to focus on developing the business cases for change and advise on policy architecture and building the evidence base to support that change that's required. Specifically, and in terms of my background, I guess I do a lot of work in low carbon liquid fuel, so more on the molecule side of the energy transition, but also industrial decarb, and sort of focus in hard to abate sectors like aviation, marine, transport and aluminium. Been doing a lot in that at the moment. Before I hand over to Nick to continue with our introduction and some initial thoughts, I sort of am very excited or am very focused on sort of the macro space at the moment, very much looking at how do we move away from whether we think about whether a project passes a narrow cost benefit test, and really looking at what does this project or this initiative, does it actually create or destroy value in real place? So let's talk about the country that this project is on, the values of the people of that place, and what is this adding or destroying in that context. So that's, for me, that's the reframing that sort of sits at the heart of this conversation, and I look forward to picking up the thread. But I'll hand over to Nicole for some introductory remarks.
Thanks, Georgine. And thank you again, Leah, for the opportunity to join this podcast. As you mentioned, I am coming from Gadigal land, and I'd also just like to reflect the same thematic that Georgine mentioned around acknowledging the traditional owners of this beautiful, beautiful land that we all, get to enjoy and share and live on. As you mentioned, I've had, 20 years of experience, and I feel very thankful for that experience. I've certainly evolved along the way in that time, and I've had the pleasure of supporting organisations across a myriad of different sustainability-related issues and risks and opportunities, across their strategy, their governance, their risk frameworks and models. More recently, very busy in the reporting side, but probably where I really enjoy playing the most is in the responsible investment space, supporting the financial services sector. Some, really exciting work that myself and the team have been involved in. I'm a pure sustainability professional in that ERS team that Georgine just mentioned, and some of the, really exciting things that we've been getting up to, lately, they're very broad. From a strategy perspective, we've been playing around and enjoying helping our clients navigate double materiality and integrating that into their strategic responses. More recently, I've had the pleasure of, from a risk perspective, supporting Igneo Infrastructure with establishing their entire risk management framework across not only enterprise risk, but importantly, integrating ESG and climate risks into the way that they intend to go about business with their new asset behind the meter infrastructure of solar BESS infrastructure development. From a reporting perspective, this piece really excites me because I've been working through this with our clients for so long now, but to support them with meeting their mandatory climate reporting regime commitments, been working alongside a technology and AI-assisted platform partner to make that process, as fit for purpose and, as undue cost and effort as possible on, particularly some of the more mid to smaller size organisations that are really struggling with, meeting some of these requirements. And lastly, from a ESG and an impact due diligence perspective, supporting some really exciting transactions, namely recently, getting involved in an anaerobic digestion plant facility development, with the use case of, generating biofuel through the feedstock of agricultural and organic type waste. So really, really broad, really exciting work. It's never boring, I can tell you that, and I'm just constantly evolving and learning as we go.
Wow. And it is just that, isn't it? It is an exciting time. And all the work that you've just described, it's so important, so significant, critically right now. So I would like to sort of circle back to what we mentioned at the beginning of the conversation was, why are we seeing an influx of sustainability-related projects fail? I wonder if you could tell us, Georgine, you've mentioned that the macro and political level is of, keen interest to you. So maybe you could explain what's going on at that level.
Yeah, really, really happy to. And sort of, it's terrific being able to sort of share this conversation with Nick because, I sort of do focus at that policy level and often sort of whole of sector level. But Nick is then really sort of helping organisations specifically sort of translate that complexity at the governance level with inside the boardroom and executive suites to understand the complexity of this. But there's no doubt we are in difficult and troubled times. I don't think anyone would dispute that. And look, some of it there's just so much that's changing, and frankly, decision making and the capacity and capability to make strategic decisions within a really with a moving target and within a really complex environment is actually really, really hard. And we're seeing a lot of inertia as a result because people can't evaluate risk. But at the end of the day, we're obviously in a huge economic transition. And so, if we take it from the energy perspective, we have gone from a position of having abundant energy to having the same amount of abundance, but what everyone is chasing for international competitiveness are green electrons, so the decarbonised electrons. And at the moment, we don't have an abundance of those electrons. We're trying to get them. We're trying to roll out the infrastructure as fast as we can. But we are struggling with the transmission or the connective tissue that really delivers that to customers. And so we've got a scarcity of that resource. And what we know is, certainly in terms of our coal-fired generation, that 65% of that will have to come off the network in under 10 years, and that needs to be replaced by renewables, and that challenge is really complex. If you then look at the market mechanisms that determine who then gets allocations of energy, it's very much on an efficiency basis, but it really has in mind that you have an abundant resource. And so it's assuming that those electrons will go to the highest bidder. But if you think about the transition in terms of people and place, so just take the spreadsheet away because it will give you one answer. But if we start to think about our communities and the mission that we've got at the federal level to say, well, we want future made in Australia, we're in this complex global operating environment where our competitors are starting to not play with the free market, but giving themselves advantage by, say, providing cheap electricity to certain sectors and industries because we want sovereign capability and we want sovereign resilience in a very uncertain world. Then the global economics starts to get very complicated. And you really then need to think about the missions that you are setting at that federal level. And they become very place-based. For example, if we're going to see the aluminium industry really struggle, which we are at the moment, we can either, as we do tend to do in Australia, it's another bailout to a big company. But at the end of the day, that infrastructure is anchor infrastructure that we've all invested in as a society, because we've created the supply chains that lead to that big investment of infrastructure. And they anchor some of our major sort of industrial ecosystems. And we are largely, we all have skin in the game. And so it becomes less about sort of just bailing out a large corporate, but sort of saying, who are we? What do we want in terms of our own sort of communities? Where do we want to be in 2050 when we've got abundant electrons again? What is the world that we want to live in? What do we want our children working in, et cetera, et cetera? And the disconnect comes both within the instruments that then have to deliver on that mission, which are sort of more designed around an Excel spreadsheet than they are on our sort of values and purpose.
Yeah.
And then I think there's a massive disconnect between who sets the mission in terms of federal government and then who's left with the change, which is the local communities. Yeah, and they have very little voice in the setting of that mission. So it's this sort of complex ecosystem that has some real structural flaws at the moment that is making this transition very problematic.
Yeah.
Of course, as soon as you get those bumps on the road, it's risk. It comes out in project delays, in communities not being on board, in councils not being able to make decisions. You start to get a whole pile of friction in the system because, you know, we can't see the pathway from top to bottom. And I think that's very much where we are at the moment. Hopefully, only we would sort of say 2035, you might start to see the easing on the energy complexity and start to see that abundance come back through and the spreadsheet can be reapplied. But in the meantime, we actually probably need a new set of tools, frankly, to get through this really difficult time.
And Nicole, what are your thoughts? You know, if projects are stacking up technically and economically, you know, from your perspective, why are we seeing so many fail?
Yeah, look, thank you for asking me that question. I think, you know, Georgine's given you a really great sort of view of the top-down view, and I'd love to sort of, you know, give you the bottom-up view through some examples. So, you know, I just think, generally speaking, assuming that just because a project's going to stack up either technically or economically, it's frankly just dangerous governance. You know, technical analysis, as Georgine has quite rightly put, within a spreadsheet isn't going to enable you to measure what the potential environmental or social impacts or unintended consequences might be. And, you know, in the work that I often do and get involved in, as I said, you know, I have the pleasure of supporting, you know, asset managers and PEs and the financial services sector with their transactions when it comes to, you know, early stages of decision making around investment. And, you know, I'll often come in and I'll do the ESG and the sort of impact due diligence and screening. And, you know, that could be for an asset or some sort of new technology or a renewable energy development project. And unfortunately, not always the case, but so often the ESG risk and opportunity component is an afterthought. Yeah. And in that deal process, you know, obviously, and I can understand this, but it's so heavily weighted to the financial and the commercial due diligence streams. And you know, unfortunately, that sort of someone along the line says, oh, we've got to do the ESG bit. And so that's when they'll pick up the phone and I'll come in. But often, you know, it is still very much a compliance tick the box exercise. You know, if you think about some sort of asset or project or initiative that has some sort of sustainability related, you know, objective, you can have the best of intentions and it can align with Australia's energy transition targets and net zero targets. It can align with corporate strategy and commercial strategy. You know, you might have identified a really sound new technology. There's a, you know, a space in the market for it, and the size of the market too is quite profitable. You know, you might even have your regulatory approvals in place. and let's use an example of, say, like a wind turbine development that's perhaps, in a really excellent rural location where there's excellent weather conditions and, it's got full funding. But if the local community that intersects with that wind turbine development feels blindsided by that project, or if there is any unintended social and environmental consequences, like, for example, I've only just come off the back of, visiting a beef producer recently who owns a large cattle station, and they're currently experiencing having some wind turbines constructed on their property. And, they shared with me their concerns around that. And, these are people that are, on selling high quality Angus beef, and they're worried about how the vibrations of the wind turbines might affect their beef quality. Equally, it could be that there's a waterway that's adjacent to the activities, or there's some sort of biodiversity loss as a result of land clearing from the development. And so, if the key stakeholders and the local communities aren't engaged in that process early on, they will resist that change. And often that can lead to, significant impacts and affecting the long-term viability of those projects.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for explaining that and giving those examples too. It makes it a lot more tangible. So on this podcast, when we, invite guest speakers on like yourselves, we also like to explore the intersection between commerciality and purpose. And I'd love to hear at Rennie how you think about balancing purpose and commercial success when you're working with your various clients to redefine sustainable success. Who wants to take that one on?
I can take that one on. Look, I think you've said it there. Like that is part of our vision and objective as Rennie. We do help our clients to redefine what it means to have sustainable success, so that not only profit but also purpose can work together, and in hopefully most cases actually boost each other as opposed to in opposition. And if we do take a look back through memory lane, once upon a time, sustainability was very much seen as a sort of philanthropic exercise, as sort of, we're doing this because we're being seen to be doing the right thing. And almost always that was at the expense of profit. And often sustainability, it lived in, an organisation's HR function. And then we sort of started to shift into this era where sustainability cropped up within the marketing and the external affairs functions, and it became more about the storytelling, feel-good side of all of these things that we're doing, and some examples might be, sponsoring the local footy team, or the storytelling that might exist within an external brochure or a fancy, report that sits on the company's website. And then if we start fast forwarding to sort of more latter eras, for the first time we started to see ESG principles integrated into strategy and into the way that organisations respond to strategy. And, there were still some issues around how reactive, the mindset might be, or how compliance focused, organisations were around that. But what I'm now seeing, which I'm delighted in, and what I'm, having most of my conversations with clients at the moment, is this real proactive shift to sort of risk and resilience, where for the first time ever, sustainability is now sort of sitting on the risk, the finance function and the board agenda. And so I guess like what I think is true sustainable success, it looks like how you balance your risks, but you also leverage your opportunities to create resilience and long-term value for your organisation.
Nick, I can. Oh, sorry, Leah. I was going to
I
say.
was just going to say, I love that framing of the risk and the resilience. And yeah, please jump in, Georgine.
Yeah, look, and I think just really sort of leaning on those points that Nick has made. What it is, that misalignment, isn't it? It's the presumption that the system, the context of your project, that it's already, that it's fine, and that if you've got approval to some extent to conduct a project, that all the ducks are lined up and everyone's expecting you to be there and all the rest of it. But I think what we really have to say to corporations and to organisations is that you've really got to question that how much work has been done to ensure that all of these things are lining up, and that happens through conversation and true connection and understanding within the place where you intend to conduct your business. Sort of the idea that we can continue to be extractive, to just turn up and expect to be able to do business without connecting, ensuring that we're aligned to the values of the community and all the rest of it, are now, I would say, big risks that organisations really need to have front of mind, because I think, communities are demonstrating very ably that they're no longer interested in the extractive approach. But I think, where we're seeing, and certainly in the work that I do, which tends to be around sort of sectoral policy shifts and sort of trying to either develop a new industry or preserve an existing industry, or navigate complexity around regulatory instruments. Where we see organisations do that really, really well is when they do a couple of things. Firstly, it's forming coalitions. So coalition forming around, for example, we did some work for the plastics sector recently on trying to design an extended producer responsibility scheme. I think it's understanding that when you are looking at the global economy and an issue for Australia that sits within that global economy, that the complexities of that are infinite. Government is under pressure to make decisions of enormous complexity across every sector in a really difficult time. And therefore, I think it's incumbent upon industry to really back in an ability to build a broad coalition and to get the evidence base that really allows government to make more considered decisions. When you do that, it's so important that organisations aren't working in their corporate interest, that they have to work in the national interest. And so you have to suspend to some extent, that push and pull of the commercial to public value.
Yeah.
So we've seen that done very well. I think in the plastic sector, I think that, a broad coalition was brought together, really complex policy design work, but really well received by government. I think where I'm seeing that not being done so well is probably in the low carbon liquid fuel space.
Okay.
Everyone wants it, and so many statements have been made. But when you get down to, and this is what we keep saying to industry, and I guess this is sort of getting back to your question of purpose and commerciality, to some extent the reason that we are brought on board is to, challenge industry a little bit to say it's not enough that you put your interest to the Australian government and haven't defined what public value you are delivering for the investment that you are asking for. And so what are the alternatives? What is it that you're asking for, and how do you justify what you're asking taxpayers to bear? So that challenges organisations. It really does challenge organisations. I really don't think we're particularly good at industry development in this country at the moment. There seems to be a mindset that we're here for the negotiation. So, we start with our best position and we expect government to argy-bargy with us until we reach an agreement. It's a commercial deal. It's not. It's public value. What public value are you delivering for taxpayer investment? And so this is some of the work that we are trying to do, and it's to be frank, it's hard, but important work, because unless we really sort of ground those truths, I just don't think we get a great result.
Oh, thanks, Georgine. And Nicole, circling, we've touched on the importance of investment and the role of supporting the financial services sector. Have you seen a shift in investor expectations?
Yeah, look, absolutely, without doubt. There's been a very, very clear and intentional shift, particularly in the last few years, of the sector and, frankly, anyone that's holding the purse strings towards more responsible investment type decision making. I think, global capital has absolutely, evolved in the last few years. I've seen institutional investors and really large major super funds, shift their focus where they're not just looking at the internal rate of return anymore in isolation. And their customers, their stakeholders, as Georgine mentioned, the Australian public, they're expecting more with where their money is being put. And they're wanting to align, like their super options, for example, more and more and more with impact. So I'm certainly seeing a definite rise in the growth of examples of impact funds, for example. I'm seeing a lot more impact investing as well. One of my clients, Swallow My Capital, they've got a really, really strong renewable energy impact investment thematic. I've seen other examples of impact funds that have introduced impact scores into the way that they screen potential investments before at that sort of early stage gating process. I've seen examples of, asset managers and portfolio managers introduce, impact metrics and impact baselines that they're actually intentionally now measuring alongside IRR to, include in their investor committee reporting and quarterly and annual reporting. The investment decision-making process, what they're looking now for is to seek to understand what the risk exposures are. And the focus is actually around that social license sort of, ESG integrity sphere before they're deploying their capital. They're looking to balance the risk and the opportunities. There's so many examples in our Australian economy of different, projects like wind and solar and transmission that have faced really severe delays, and they've, experienced very costly court battles because that environmental and the social impact element was ignored in the early stages of the development process. There's a really well-known example in Australia of a wind farm up in Rockhampton, the Moonlight Range wind farm. It's like $1 billion project development that was on its way. It had its technical, business case all stacked up. It even had conditional approval from government. And then there was an inquiry into the project. And it turns out that there had been inadequate community and stakeholder engagement as part of those early stages of the process. And it turns out there was a lot of major concerns from those locals, those, farming communities that were going to be impacted by this development. Investors want to avoid those kind of situations, and so for that reason, they do understand how important it is now to integrate some of this thinking into their decision making.
Yeah, when it comes to, looking into the risk and the opportunity, as you pointed out, and making better decisions. We spoke recently, Nicole, and you mentioned materiality and double materiality. I wondered if you could unpack what those concepts mean and why they are becoming so important for organisations today?
Yeah, certainly. Your listeners might be familiar with these terms, but, financial materiality, it often is more of an inward-looking concept where an organisation might ask itself, how do these sustainability or these social or these climate type risks financially impact our own bottom line if we don't get these things right? And it's very much a single lens focus. It's, a very corporate risk-driven process. Then you have impact materiality, and that's traditionally been more of an outward-focused approach where an organisation might ask themselves, how do our physical operations or, the construction activities that we're currently undertaking, or just our simple presence, how do we affect the environment or the society in which we're interacting with, and what's important to those external stakeholders? And then you have this concept of double materiality, which is the combination of those two, really critical lenses to force a company to balance both an inward and an outward perspective. And it allows them to really narrow down, where are they going to make the most impact? What is most critical to the survival and the resilience of that business or that business opportunity? I think that double materiality is a game changer. I'm seeing organisations really start to get under the hood and introduce double materiality into their strategic response processes. I think, with this swell of, mandatory climate-related reporting now that exists within Australia and broadly, sustainability reporting too globally, boards can no longer ignore their obligations around that, and they do need to look to balance both.
Yeah, and you've also spoken about, social impact modelling, impact assessments, unintended consequences have come up a bit in our conversation so far. How are these tools helping organisations make better decisions before projects even begin?
Yeah, look, Georgine sort of touched on a little bit of the modelling work that we've recently done around, unintended consequence and changes to policy around packaging. So the introduction of, eco-modulated pricing and potential minimum recycled content mandates that have a flow-on effect onto the consumer, literally into their shopping basket. I like to think of the modelling work that our team does and can do as a bit of an early warning system, if you will, where you're breaking down these principles of environmental or social economics in a way that you can simulate the sort of potential consequences of a project or initiative before any policy change occurs or before any external commitments are made or before you invest any capital. If I was to use an example, if an organisation was looking at introducing some solar type technology and solutions to solve their energy requirements, and they're looking to develop and construct some infrastructure into a small rural community that's adjacent to their operation, there could be some really significant secondary impacts of that. I'll draw from the wind farm experience that I just shared with you, but, accommodation within the town, where are all of the workers going to live while they're, involved in the construction activities? If they do rent out the local hotel or motel, or if they sort of take up all of the Airbnbs and the rentals in the town, rental prices are likely to skyrocket due to the limited supply of the accommodation in the town. And locals could literally be priced out of their own town. And I've actually seen this happen firsthand in my own family. We're a farming family from down in the southwest of WA, a beautiful little town, rural town called Hopeton. And, there was a nickel mine that had an influx of workers that came in. And as a result, my own grandma got priced out of her rental property. So these issues, they are real. And the impact that they can have is quite significant. And if an organisation, takes the time to understand what the potential scenarios are and what the different sensitivities are in a project or an initiative, they're much better placed to, I guess, cushion the, latter unintended effects later down the track.
And Georgine, if organisations are embracing this, broader way of thinking, what impact could it have on the quality of decisions being made across Australia's energy transition?
Well, I guess, Leah, if we all had our way, we'd have regenerative industry, wouldn't we? Industry that not only minimises downside risk and detrimental impacts to the environment in particular and social, but in fact leaves a place or an environment better off than when it started. I mean, that would ultimately be where we would be. There's unfortunately, there's a lot of things playing against that. Our whole economic framing, unfortunately, is very much sort of based on an extractive model. But ultimately, what we want to get to is, we are all people. We are our economy is to serve society. Apparently, we would like it to serve society. So what does that mean? And that can't just be shareholder value. And as much as we talk about the sustainability lens, in seeing that truly delivered, I guess, is where we would love to be. But in the meantime, because there's a few things we've got to fix to get that right, including just even how we define value within our economic structure. How we, is GDP the measure that really sort of tells the story of who we are and how we feel and how we see our environment. So we've got some big macro things stacked against us. But I think if you take it just down to an organisational investor level, I think that enduring long-term impact, that ability to de-risk to the point where you can really successfully deliver on something that has been defined beyond the economic boundary. So, if we can, if organisations can accept that success should be beyond the percentage revenue, but it should be, how many people were gainfully employed, how many lives were changed, how many environments were restored and improved. That long-term deep value. That's the aspiration. Unfortunately, I think we're a long way from there at the moment, but that's certainly the aspiration.
Yeah. And Nicole, you work with lots of different organisations across Australia. How are they positioning themselves well for the future?
I'm going to come back to that term that I've used a few times today, which it does really excite me, but the term resilience. I think that all of the smarter organisations are really starting to focus in on how they are in terms of their own resilience, and they are going back to some, quite frankly, basic risk management fundamentals where, they are broadening their mindset to embed, concepts like social license and, some of these methods that I mentioned earlier around financial and double materiality directly into how they go about responding strategically. Most importantly, and I know Georgine will agree with this because we've done lots of work in this space, is they're actually proactively or, in a coalition, they are engaging with their whole of value chain. They recognise that they are sitting within an ecosystem of interdependencies, and they're raising awareness to who those external stakeholders are that they might not be within the sphere of control, to understand what is, most important to them, or, where are the challenges, what are the enablers, and understand what they need, to happen to get it right. But most importantly, they're collaborating and they're involving those stakeholders in, the design, the early upfront, proactive design of whatever those strategies or solutions or mitigations are. I've mentioned this as well. They're doing the stress testing. So they're understanding what potential scenarios might be and what the sensitivities are within those scenarios to stress test, so that they can build really robust, transition plans through this next tranche that Georgine has, really clearly articulated the challenge. And then lastly, they're also being very considered and careful, and they're proactively now seeking more independent or external review or assurance of their outward-facing commitments and communications, so that they can avoid issues like greenwashing risks or compliance or litigation shocks later down the track.
Yeah, nicely put. And Georgine, at Juntos, we often see that communications and research and behaviour change have a really important role to play in sustainability initiatives and projects. From your perspective, how do you see these disciplines, helping build that trust and understanding and social license needed?
Look, I think, and we can have a collective therapy session perhaps here, because we all know how hard it is in sort of technical environments and heavily commercial environments to be holding kind of, the disciplines, I guess, that are trying to take a systems approach and sort of trying to get that acknowledged in and respected in the ways that it should be. But I almost wonder if we need to almost retitle the communications sort of groups, because I actually think the biggest activity that they are so vital for is listening. So if you are, as a communications group, just selling the message of your organisation, I think, the risk-based approach is already missing, I really think the biggest challenge we can make back to our organisations is to challenge them to listen.
Yeah.
So we all know what our own message is, but how is it going to be received? Have we listened to people? Do we know the context that they're coming from in terms of what they're thinking and therefore how that message will land? If anyone is close to that, I think it's the communications team. They are often as good at listening as they are good at communicating. Yeah. And it's the listening that is so vital to really sort of thread this back up through to our mission. So I think the research obviously goes hand in hand with that in terms of being able to really get the evidence base. And then I think too, again, industry tends to have a habit of coming from a negotiating position. This is not a negotiation. Yeah. This is about true and deep understanding, and then sort of being adaptable to create a commercial win-win plus a values-based win-win and other things. But to be able to really play with all of that value at the table, you've got to have discovered what it is in the first place. So I think, I just think the communications, the research, the evidence base, all of those disciplines are more vital than they've ever been to de-risk. And, it's sort of truth to the numbers, if that makes sense. So, it's vital.
Yeah, it certainly does make sense. I like the way that you've really emphasised the importance of listening in the communications discipline, and circling back to what's been discussed throughout this conversation around consulting, whether that's community or the key stakeholders, ensuring their voices are heard and listened to right from the very beginning of a project. And I really liked as well, Georgine, that several times it's become really evident to me that you've touched on, the importance of place, and that sounds like that place-based approach is so critical.
Yeah.
So Nicole and Georgine, thank you both so much for joining the podcast today, Marketing for Good. It's been such a fascinating conversation. If people want to connect with Rennie Advisory, and learn more about the work that you do, where would be the best place to send them?
Nick, you probably got some thoughts. We are very active on LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
You can always find us there. We also have a very swanky website these days. But also, I mean, Nick and I, we contribute in a lot of forums, and so really happy to catch up with people in our respective communities as well, because we're both are very active. So, yeah, really looking forward to connecting with people who are interested in these issues, and, happy to keep the communication and conversation going, because it's going to be a collective effort to get the good, isn't it?
Yes. Most certainly.
Spot on.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again. And we look forward to hearing updates on how, your current work is going, and best of luck, in these complex and challenging but very important times.
Lovely. Thanks so much for hosting.
Thank you so much for your time, Leah.
Thank you.
Thank you. All the best, everyone. Take care.